Have you ever finished a Sunday feeling great about the message, only to feel strangely irrelevant by Monday? Definitely by Tuesday. If you have ever preached or taught people on a Sunday, the answer is yes. And here's what I know about you: you prepared well, you spoke clearly, people nodded along. Some people even took notes. That always feels good, doesn't it? And yet, substantial kind of spiritual growth, I don't know, it just doesn't feel like it's happening. I mean, maybe it is. Maybe God's doing something that we don't even notice or perceive, but it feels that way. And as we talk to people in our church, we begin to feel that those feelings are actually realities. Maybe there isn't as much growth happening. Our mission is spiritual growth, is discipleship. And when we don't see that happening, no matter how hard we work, man, it is frustrating. I mean, first things first, though, this is actually not an ability or a skill problem for you. It is, though, about the environment you are now leading your church in. In our last podcast, we unpacked this idea of the experience economy and the layers that are sitting on top of that today. I would highly encourage you to either go to gavinadams.com, you can read about it there, or just listen to the previous podcast to get some more information on this, okay? Quick recap. As we said, we are not just in an experience economy anymore. Okay, we were in the 80s and the 90s, but over the last, 15 or so years, we have been operating inside of what is being called a layered economy. An experience is the foundation of the economy, but there are three other layers sitting on top of it. And that first layer is the attention economy. And here's the hard truth about the attention economy. It is not designed for spiritual formation. In fact, the attention economy isn't designed for formation of any kind. It is designed for interruption. Like in the attention economy, the layer sitting on top, speed is what wins, right? Not time, which discipleship takes time. Emotion spreads quickly, not wisdom, not depth, but emotion. Outrage multiplies. Have you noticed that anywhere? Novelty dominates, right? But the spiritual growth, right? It doesn't happen like in that. None of those things lead to deep spiritual growth or transformation of any kind. I mean, transformation requires repetition. It requires trust and proximity and clear next steps. It takes time. So when churches try to compete primarily through content volume, production quality, or distribution strategy, we're actually playing inside rules that were built for completely different outcomes. And here's the problem. Eventually, that creates a lot of discouragement because you are working so hard to gain attention, but attention isn't going to lead to transformation. In fact, more engagement might mean less obedience in some ways. More reach can create less transformation. I mean, have you ever felt like your church, like Instagram posts were getting more likes, while at the same time your people were becoming less likable? That's the attention economy. This attraction, right? This attention, it's not going to go anywhere. Okay, the attention economy isn't going anywhere, and it's sitting on top of experience, and it's probably not changing anytime soon. If we can't compete, right, with social media influencers or cable news or whatever it is that's gaining attention of everybody in our church, what can we do? I mean, how do we function in this economy? Well, I'd like to suggest that we shift something, and it's our perspective. And the perspective shift we have to have is around content. The attention economy is primarily built around content. And as we said, quick content, outrageous content, loud content. Well, we don't want to compete in that space because it doesn't lead to discipleship. It doesn't lead to transformation. Here's kind of what I mean, though, by shifting our perspective on it. In today's world, listen, content for us as churches, in today's church world, content is not our product. Content is the invitation to the mission. Think about this for a second. Content is not our product. And that may be hard to think about because, again, go back if you're old enough like me, 80s, 90s, 2000s, especially up until maybe 2010. Content was king. I remember leading churches when we had to make tapes or duplicate, CDs in the back of the room to give to volunteers or to put on sale. If you weren't in the room, you didn't get the content back then. Well, think about how much has changed and how quickly it has changed, right? Content is no longer king. Content is a commodity. It's not our product. Content, though, it is an invitation to discipleship. It's an invitation, as we'll talk a lot more about in a couple of weeks, to transformation. If you're trying to compete as a church in the attention economy, content is the product. And content for us is a commodity. You're never going to win in that space. But if we want to leverage attention, right, not compete to gain attention, we do have an advantage because our content creates an invitation for something much more substantial than just a few seconds of attention. Let me give you an example, right? Think about your sermon just for a second. Like, think of your sermon not as a destination. What if you thought about it as a doorway? Well, what if your message this Sunday was an invitation to take a step towards something deeper? It's the doorway to something, not the end result. Right? If your content, right, is not clearly connected to a defined pathway that eventually leads to a step, people are going to experience truth, but they're never going to, and this is a really important word for us, integrate it. They're not going to integrate it. And integration is where discipleship actually happens. Let's make this just really, really practical for us, okay? This week, what if you could just take your most recent message, or if you work in children's ministry or somewhere else, just take what you taught, whatever it was, and ask 3 specific questions about the content. 3 questions about the content. All right, first, who was this specifically for? Who was this content specifically for? If you say everybody in the room, well, that's generic. And not, it can't be generic and move people dramatically. Right? Generic content doesn't really move everyone. I mean, not everyone in your room is going to be moved by every message, right? So, was it for discouraged parents or fathers, emerging leaders, new believers, spiritually stuck attenders? Again, not to get too specific. However, the more specific you can be around who the content is for, the better your content is going to be delivered. Now, the scripture may be for everybody. The truth of your message, the principle may be for everybody. However, how did you give application steps for people? How did you create, and we love this phrase in preaching, concentric circles for different categories of people in your church, right? If you got to clarify around the right person. And when you do that, it changes how you can guide application and response. So that's the first question. Who was that content really for? Number 2, what should be different in them over time if they actually apply to what they heard? Okay, not what should they understand, but what should shift in their identity, their habits, or their relationships because of what they heard. And then here's the third thing. What is the right next step? And be very specific. Coming out of the message, out of whatever was taught on Sunday, what was the specific step that you were hoping the specific person you were speaking to would take? Was it to engage in community somehow through groups or a class, or was it maybe to join a serving team or begin serving in the community, or for whatever breaks your heart for God to use it to change something? Was it to schedule a meeting, a conversation, find a mentor, beginning reading plan, read a book, listen to a specific podcast, and ask some hard questions about, what was it? Commit to accountability. What was the specific ask? Because again, content is an invitation for transformation, right? Content isn't king. Content isn't about attention. It's about opening a door to take a step. And when we think that way about it, we don't just compete in the attention economy. We begin to leverage attention for transformation. And I don't know, maybe this will make us all feel a little bit better, but you don't need, right, to your reach to be viral. You don't need a viral reach for God to do amazing things in your church. What you really need is just consistent influence with the people that God has entrusted to you. So remember, the goal is not to win everyone's attention. It's to steward it when we have it. And when we see attention as a doorway, it helps discipleship move from maybe something that's stagnant in our church to something that's moving forward. Because, right, the solution isn't more noise. There's so much noise in the world today. For us as a church, what we're trying to do is create clear direction. And that begins by shifting the internal question from how do we grow our reach to how do we design for transformation? And here's a hint, by the way, when people's lives begin to transform, your reach is going to grow whether you try or not. So now, let's just admit for a minute, this is slower work, okay? This is not flashy. This is not about likes and shares. It's much deeper than that. And it's probably not going to trend. It's not going to feel trendy or trend-worthy. But what you're doing when you think this way, you're beginning to build depth. And depth is the only thing that actually lasts. So you can't out-content the internet. Don't even try. But you can build a church that changes lives. And that's the mission anyway.